This fall, artist Suzanne Brennan Furstenberg installed 700,000 white flags across the National Mall in Washington, D.C., to symbolize the number of lives that had then been lost in America since the start of the coronavirus pandemic. In an opinion piece that she published in the Washington Post, Furstenberg explained that she did this in an effort to reclaim the dignity of 700,000 people who have become reduced to a single number, a number too large to fathom. In addition to being an artist, Furstenberg is also a hospice volunteer, a role that she has occupied for 25 years now. She maintained that volunteering in that capacity taught her that the most important thing we can afford people is their dignity in life as well as in death. My project began with outrage, she explained. I was outraged that we had elected officials who could devalue the lives of the elderly, the poor, and people of color in their approach to managing the pandemic, she admitted. I was outraged how we had allowed the death toll here in the United States to become so large as to be incomprehensible. But she did not seethe in silence. She wanted to make a public statement. She wanted her sentiments to be heard and seen. Her large-scale installation was aptly titled, "In America, Remember." The symbolism of a white flag waving is universally understood. It signifies surrender, it signifies defeat. Alongside the white flags, Furstenberg put out permanent markers so that the people visiting her art installation could inscribe their own messages there. She reported being surprised by the wide array of them. A couple who had been infected with COVID by their friend survived the virus while he died. They designated a flag on the mall to commemorate his death. One flag commemorated the death of a 99-year-old veteran of World War II who refused a ventilator so that a younger patient could have use of it. A widow wrote a message to her late husband, who died on the very day he should have been celebrating his 23rd wedding anniversary with her. The mall became a sea of grief, and the people writing their final farewells using Sharpies were all weathering the emotional storm the best they could. For a brief time, they were together in the same boat. Not only has this art helped individual people in their grief, it has also created a community. So many of these deaths happened in isolation, and families mourned in isolation, Furstenberg wrote. But in the midst of 20 acres of flags, loved ones know they are no longer mourning on their own. One woman who lost her father said to me, "All this time I thought I was grieving alone, but now I see that I was in the company of many." Their invisible connections were rendered visible by this particular artist. These connections felt like ties that could bind, that could lash all of them to the mast, that could hold them securely in the land of the living for a while longer. The artist declared, "I knew people would bring their grief, their outrage, their anger. I did not realize what the art would give back in its own way, providing loved ones solace or catharsis as it provided dignity to the coronavirus victims." Certainly, there is no kind of catharsis quite as potent as communal catharsis. It helps explain why we hold memorial services en masse in our churches, synagogues, temples, and meeting houses. But the pandemic, this prolonged pandemic, has far exceeded their holding capacity. Besides, most of them have not been open for the majority of that time. So our national capital this fall was awash with white flags, and the people who came to watch them flutter in the wind. The year that I graduated college, I moved to Washington to work for a news service and found an apartment, my first, a studio, right in the heart of Capitol Hill. Any time that I felt lost in this new city in my adult life, I could easily wander among the monuments. I spent a lot of time wandering among them. That fall, the Names Project AIDS quilt came to the city and blanketed the National Mall. Like Furstenberg's piece, it was a massive installment. I had never seen anything like it before, and neither have I ever seen anything like it since. The scale of it was literally staggering. I went alone to see it. I wanted the time to make sense of it, and it took a great deal of time to do so. There were thousands upon thousands of squares pieced together over the course of the AIDS crisis. And each panel was dedicated to a person who had lost their lives to a late-stage human immunodeficiency virus. Initially, my intention was to visit every single square and read every single name, but I could not succeed in that endeavor. The day simply was not long enough. A few years later, I was still living in Washington and writing for newspapers when my father, who was away on vacation, died very suddenly in a foreign hospital. By that time, I was living in a different studio apartment. I was alone in it when I got the phone call, and getting word, I keened so loudly that I scared my cat. Then I collected myself and started making calls, calm and factual calls. I called one friend to tell her that I was sorry I couldn't make her party that weekend because my father had just died. I called my minister to tell her that I was sorry I would have to miss my small group at church because my father had just died. I called another friend to ask if he could help me with a local cat sitter because my father had just died. And before I knew it, all these kind people were at my front door, in my apartment, and then someone ordered Chinese takeout, and we crowded around my tiny bistro table and had dinner together. And after only a few bites of scallion pancake, I knew that somehow I would survive this loss. It was just such impromptu gatherings around the bereaved that became impossible during this pandemic, when those were most desperately needed and mourners had become far too commonplace everywhere. The comforting customs we humans had devised over millennia of mourning were forbidden by the strange circumstances of this pandemic. As your minister, I was not able to make home visitations and hold hands with you. I was not able to gather around your table and break bread. The sadness of that is substantial for you and for me. In the months after my father's death, my oldest, dearest, and fiercest friend phoned me frequently. It was clear that I was on her priority call list. She routinely demanded to know if I was eating and how I was sleeping. She understood that I had grown a bit too accustomed to death. As a 20-something, I had already lost all my parents and grandparents and a couple of siblings too, which considerably complicated my family situation. So one day she called to pose this pointed question to me: do you feel cheated? Because the question had never occurred to me before, I took a few moments to consider it. Yes, I replied, yes, I do. Good, she told me, because you were cheated. She suggested that I might feel envy when I saw our friends out with their fathers, that I might ruefully wonder why their fathers were still alive while mine was not. And that was not actually part of my personal experience of grief. What did bother me, surprisingly, and with an intensity I even now struggle to explain, were other demonstrations of public grief. While I no longer remember the national tragedy being commemorated, I do remember the day when the bells of the National Cathedral were pealing loudly. Nearly all of Washington could hear them. What I remember asking myself bitterly was why those bells were ringing for complete strangers instead of for my father. Why should they be recognized in a way that he was not? Now I think of all those who have been cheated by COVID, who have lost their parents and grandparents, children and siblings, spouses and friends, neighbors and colleagues, and my heart aches for them. Our hearts ache for them. According to Harvard professor Susanna Siegel, substantive damage is done when any death is not given its due. In a recent interview, she told a reporter, both in politics and in everyday life, one of the worst things we could ever do is get used to death, treat it as unremarkable or anything other than a loss. This fact has profound consequences for every facet of life and all forms of human consciousness. Professor Siegel notes that some of the common reactions she has seen during this pandemic are basically refusals to recognize the terribleness of death. Deaths can seem even more haunting when they're not recognized as a real loss, she maintained. She pointed to the obituaries as an important forum for presenting deaths as a loss to the public, and noted that when deaths are not rendered as losses to the public, they are depicted in a way that erodes civic regard. Newspapers across this country cannot keep their obituaries current. And the professor insisted that we all need to acknowledge each lost life in a communal way that does justice to the gravity of every death, and that we do this without exception. This week, the official death toll of COVID surpassed 5 million lives, a grim milestone. According to the latest figures compiled in the Washington Post, now more than 750,000 lives have been lost in the US since the start of the pandemic. Perhaps one of those lives or more has been intimately connected with yours. And here is another strange marker. We have now lost more American lives to COVID in 2 years than we have lost to HIV/AIDS in 4 decades. This fall, we had our first in-person memorial service in our sanctuary since the last one that had been held here in February 2020. In the Jewish tradition, mourners say the Kaddish for only 1 year after the loss of a loved one. Let the glory of all life be extolled, let all life be blessed, as all life is glorified, exalted, and honored, beyond all the praises, songs, and adorations we can utter. The Reverend Julianne Silberman Bunn writes, let all life be extolled for as long as it needs to be. In the midst of this prolonged pandemic, I believe that each one of us is due an extension. Like many of you, I remain highly conscious of the memorials that remain to be planned here at UU Wellesley Hills for Tommy Weil and Alice Robinson and Eve Slater and Pete Schellenberg. What happens when our grief is so long postponed? We are only now learning. As it stands, Professor Siegel declared, death shapes the horizon of life. We cannot deny that. In January 2021, we held an evening vigil on this church campus as part of a national COVID memorial observance, and the Srinivas family tolled our church bell for everyone in town to hear. Many of our friends and members were far out of earshot, however. Now we are entering a new phase of this pandemic. Some media channels have characterized it as the long tail of this pandemic, while others have explained it as a transitional phase in public health, when COVID simply becomes endemic in America. Either way, its lingering effects will be felt for a while yet. We did not hold a Remembrance Day in November 2020. We did not think it was appropriate to hold such a service online. Now I second-guess that decision because this particular Remembrance Day seems so long overdue. When grief comes upon us in waves and the helpless heart overflows in sadness and aching tears, we remember, the Reverend Kendall Gibbons wrote. When communities come together and hurt is shared in mutual comfort and consolation, we remember. I hope that each of you is able to find comfort and consolation during this service. And if you have yet to drop a crystal in the bowl, you are invited to do so during our extended musical postlude today. It is not too late to honor any single loss, I promise you. Remind yourself that it is not yours alone. To a stunning extent, it belongs to every one of us in your all too human family. Whether your loss is recent or historical, COVID-related or not, it matters to me and it matters to us here and now. However defeated we feel by this pandemic, we cannot, we should never surrender our sacred right to grief. Looking back on the installation she created when she planted those 700,000 white flags in the National Mall this September, Furstenberg observed, "The power of art is not in my hands as an artist, it is in the souls of those who experience it." She is entirely right about that. Your souls, each one of your souls, has such a mighty capacity. They can stretch to hold the losses that you individually have known and also that you communally have encountered. Your souls can grow more capacious with each life you have sincerely grieved. Have you noticed that? I have. I have seen it in you, and honestly, I have seen it with you.